Hey, welcome to Unsolicited Book Reviews with Michael David MacBride. Hey, that's me. Typically, this is a podcast collection of reviews that I've done of different books, but I'm recording a couple of these special episodes where I invite friends or other people I know, acquaintances, to talk about books that they've chosen. So um, that's what we'll have here is a conversation. It'll be about 25 to 40 minutes long about a book they picked, kind of why they chose that book and how they first heard about it. And then, we'll unpack kind of thoughts that we have about it as well. Ready? Let's go.
Thanks for joining me on Unsolicited Book Reviews with Michael David McBride. That's me. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Graham Johnson, who I met through a mutual friend. And Graham is a reporter for the Chasker Herald, a local paper just across the river. And welcome, Graham. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really good to be here.
Yeah, so I know very little bit about you because we met up for coffee and just kind of chatted. But since then, I don't know, I felt like I kind of found a kindred soul. And I know you're also a writer as well. Do you want to say a little bit about what you're working on or the kind of stuff that you write currently?
Sure. Yeah, so I've worked on a couple of books that are in the process of getting published somewhere along the way. I'm currently working on a murder mystery that I'm quite excited about, which is kind of how we met, was through the writing group that you also were writing with. And then, yeah, I've been sending out short stories along the way, but yeah, mostly these days I'm writing for the paper.
Yeah, so at the coffee shop, we were just kind of chatting, and I told you about the podcast and asked him if there was a book that he'd want to read, and he suggested The Fisherman by John Langan. Langan? Oh.
Yeah, thank you.
Which I had never heard of before. So I love hearing stories about books, and when someone has one that they're interested in for whatever reason, I'm totally game. So do you remember where you first heard about The Fisherman?
Yeah, I do. It's been on my list of books to read for years now. I read about it in a blog post from the Tor.com blog. I think now they changed their name to The Reactor or something along those lines. But they had a list of horror stories or not horror novels ranked by how horrifying they were. And so it kind of went from very soft hitting to at the bottom. The scariest book that they could come up with was The Fisherman by John Langan. And I really like horror. I really like, sitting up at night with lights on, unable to sleep. And so that, rang all the bells where I said, I need to read this book. And then it won the Dracula Award in 2016, or it wasn't the Bram Stoker Award in
Yeah, I think
2016.
Bram Stoker. Yep.
Yeah, and that's an award that I kind of peripherally follow, and so that made me really excited about it. And yeah, and then it took until you asking, "Hey, is there a book you want to read?" And so this was, yeah, it must have been 7 or 8 years ago. Like I was back in school when I read it, and it has still been on that list ever since then. So yeah, I'm glad we finally got around to doing it.
Yeah, it's funny how books follow you around like that. I used to teach, and so I would buy books and then get books, periodically, and you get desk copies. And at one point, my wife and I were moving around the country, and we had so many boxes of books, and I was just like, this is kind of ridiculous. And I looked at how many I had that I had never read or even opened, and I was like, I need to do something about this. And so I literally read everything in the house. And then it took me probably 3 years eventually. And she made a deal with me where I couldn't buy new books until I think it was until three leave the house. Like I could get a new book for every three I got rid of. And now like when I'm done with a book for the most part, I give it away. Or this one I got through the library. So thanks, Scott County Library.
Yeah.
Their interlibrary loan people love me. I keep them very busy. So
Yeah. Yeah, and moving books are so heavy too. My partner has gotten mad at me a lot of times for being forced to carry, boxes full of books up and downstairs.
yeah. So you enjoy horror. Weirdly, as a young reader, I used to read more horror for whatever reason. I think I was like at a cottage or something, and they had a bunch of Stephen King books, and
Okay.
I was like, I don't know what this is, but all right, I'll read it. And so I started reading them, and I thoroughly enjoy Stephen King. And then I kind of fell down the rabbit hole of like Edgar Allan Poe and Lovecraft, and I feel like all of those are kind of in The Fisherman. But weirdly, I don't read a lot of horror, and I'm kind of curious, like what draws you to the genre? What do you enjoy about it? That thrill of being kept up at night?
Yeah, it's something that I've come to realize after, reading a lot of horror and writing a lot of horror is that a lot of times for me, it's not about necessarily being scared. I'll read something. This was, according to Reactor, the scariest book, they had as of 2016. And, and I wasn't sitting up at night for it. And, when I'm writing horror, it's not about, trying to, scare the hell out of someone. A lot of times I think it's just an opportunity to kind of use a lot more of the genre tropes of like kind of dealing with darker material, kind of being able to mess around with something more macabre and deal out a little bit of destruction and mayhem a little bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's kind of where I'm coming from. But honestly, if I can spend a sleepless night worried about something coming through my front door, that's a good thing too.
Sure. Well, for anybody who hasn't read it, I guess like the quick encapsulated version is Abe, our kind of our protagonist, loses his wife and is going through like a grieving process, and he finds fishing as kind of therapeutic, I guess, for lack of a better way of describing it, and then kind of finds a is it Dan? Is that his name?
Dan is the other man, yeah.
And he has similarly lost his wife, or was it son? I can't
his
remember.
family, his wife and his two sons.
That's right. And so they kind of bond by grief, and they kind of go on this fishing adventure. And then there's like this weird interlude, which I'm a fan of inset stories. So
Yeah.
like when I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is like Dracula, this is like Frankenstein, this is like,
Lovecraft.
all of these other Lovecraftian stories, that kind of stuff. So I was a big fan of it. And there's this chunk that you could probably pull right out of the book if you wanted to, that tells all the backstory before we get kind of caught up to speed again. And in there's a lot of grieving as well. And then, there's the supernatural elements that come up. What did I miss that's important or that stuck out to you? Just kind of big picture, if somebody has no idea what the Fisherman's about, how would you sell it to them? Or
Yeah, I mean, it's a story about grief. It's about how Abe and Dan deal with their grief because they deal with it very differently. And that is kind of the central conflict of the story, especially after our long hiatus from, them. But yeah, I mean, it wears its heart on its sleeve. All of those, gothic, Lovecraftian influences are so apparent. I was reading a review from, who was it? Three Crows magazine, and something they said that stuck out to me was that the diner, the proprietor of the diner, the owner, his name is Howard, and they were like, "Oh, this is just a very thinly veiled reference to it's Lovecraft telling them the story, Howard Philip
Sure.
Lovecraft." And I was like, "Oh yeah, of course, that's what it is." I mean, it's that kind of obvious, level of, and so if you're into that kind of gothic, into that kind of macabre, into that kind of cosmic horror, it is all there. But it feels very kind of down to earth, especially in the non-flashbacks part of it. And I think that's worth noting. Something you said was that they, if you could just remove that central piece out and that could just stand alone. I looked into it after I finished the book. The book is about 260 pages long. The flashback starts on page 49 and ends on 193. So it is a majority of the book. And it's kind of jarring where they spend a lot of time. I think it would be very interesting because I'm also a big fan of those frame novels or frame stories. How we get there, right? Because we're following Abe and Dan, and then they go to the coffee shop where Howard tells them the story that he got from Reverend Mapple, who he got from a woman in a nursing home who was part of his church, and then it was a friend of her dad's that the kind of action happened to, who he found out about because it was the mayor of their town. And so you're kind of 5 layers deep there, right? And I think it works really well, but yeah, at a certain point you could just lift it out. It stands, not that it doesn't connect, but initially you're kind of, when you're 40 pages into this kind of tangent, I was like, what, where are we going with this? Where's Abe? Where's Dan? What's going on?
Yeah, I love the, like you said, the so many steps removed, because for me that felt very realistic. Like
Yeah.
anytime I ever heard about a haunted house or
Yeah.
something that had happened, it was never to the person I was speaking to. It was always my brother's cousin, sister's friend told this story, blah blah blah. And somehow that distance makes it feel more real to me.
Yeah.
And you get a little taste of each of those characters through the story as well, and just kind of what their role is. There's this mysterious guest, and there's all these elements that were, I, I mean, honestly, I didn't find it scary. I enjoyed it. I
Yeah.
enjoyed the story for sure. So it's funny to think that Tor or Reactor or whatever they are now, I can't help but think of them as Tor, and I don't know why they changed their name, but
Yeah. Yeah. I like Tor as well.
but I can't help but think about like what they were considering was scary at the time.
I'd like to find that list again. I bet I could dig it up and send it to you because I want to know what else was there. Because some of them I remember having read at the time, but then when they said, "Oh, all of that is weak tea compared to the Fisherman," I was like, "Oh my god, I have to read it." But yeah, no, it wasn't something that I read, and it was like, very scary. It was, kind of just more macabre, more gothic, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
As an author, I always wonder like, how does this author, how does John Langan find this story? Like what's the grain that tells him that he wants to write this story? For me, I look to old news stories or something like
yeah,
that. I could imagine, maybe he's hanging out and someone tells him this old Dutch legend, or because I've never I've never heard like the supernatural element of this, the fisherman and his lines and hooking into the kind of souls or whatever of different
yeah,
people. And like that's something I've never heard of before. Visually, very interesting. I could
yeah,
imagine this being on film.
yeah. The
Uh,
Dark Sea, it was all
yeah,
there.
right. So I'm like, God, what was the kernel that told him that like I want to tell this story and I want to do it in a very classic horror gothic kind of approach.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if it started with Abe and Dan or if it started with the Fisherman. Um, because yeah, they almost at a certain point they do feel a little discreet, and so I wonder if it was just adding on frame narratives until you got out to, and then like at the end of the novel, there is a period of time after you leave this flashback where some time kind of passes, and they really kind of go out of their way to make it feel. I mean, they like walk through like US elections. They talk about 9/11. And I was, it was just kind of strange where they talk about the passing of time and you're just kind of finally back in the present after being in, I think it was the 20s or 30s.
Yeah.
And it was kind of jarring. Um, but yeah, I wonder whether or not started in the middle and built out or started out built in.
Yeah, it's funny, writing, and I'm sure you do as well. Like you can't help but start to deconstruct things that you read at a certain point,
Oh yeah.
Like as much as you can read for enjoyment, there's also this part of like, how's this working? And like what especially, something that gets, published in a big press and gets a lot of attention, like, okay, great. What was the process? Like, what was
Yeah.
the original script? What was the original manuscript like that he turned in and said, here's my next book? And the editor goes, whoa, wait a second.
Yeah.
Like we need to ground this in the present to make people care about it, maybe. Or,
Right. Well, that's something I was thinking because I mean, we are coming from this on a little bit of other angles, but I've had, people in writing groups, I've had professors be like, you can't have this long of a flashback. Just write the flashback if that's your story. I wonder if you told that to students where it's like, this is such a, like, the book construction is wild that way. I don't know. I mean, is that something you had, have you told students or you're, familiar with that debate?
I taught literature, so I didn't really teach the creative writing aspects.
Yeah.
But I'm personally, for as a reader, I love books that challenge the norms, and do weird things. I mean, the word is novel, and I want something to be new and compelling. And
Yeah.
so those are the books I almost always look for. So for me, I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of fun, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas like a lot of the reviews, because I looked too, I was kind of curious like what other people said, and almost all of the negative reviews were like, what the hell? Like, why is there this massive flashback and like, he needs to be more present, and the fact that he's like, like you're being told a story instead of seeing the action, and
Yeah.
like it didn't. I don't know. I enjoyed it, so I was like, I'm along for the ride, but
Right.
other people clearly did not.
And I think that Langan was really aware of that, because there's a line, I just read it, it's near the end of the book, where after the flashback, and then as Dan and Abe are out in this mysterious creek, and something is revealed about Dan, and he starts telling this kind of little story about how he came to hear about it, and Abe says something along the lines of like, at this point I was pretty storied out. And I laughed out loud when I was reading it, because you just got through 150 pages of someone telling you a story of a story of a story of a story, and then you get launched into like another 2-page story of Dan. And I was laughing because like I have to imagine some editor was like, you gotta address this, man. Like, this is too much.
Yeah, no, I love moments like that where there's kind of the tongue in cheek or wink at the reader almost, and you know, because yeah, I mean, if you imagine sitting in that diner for uh, however long it must have taken to
Hours.
tell that
Yeah.
story,
Yeah.
and then there's even a weird supernatural element to the way that story is told, where he addresses the fact that like he is aware of things that this person could not have necessarily
Oh
been aware of,
yeah.
which I thought was weird, kind of an interesting aspect to it. And so then I was like, are we supposed to believe that they really sat? And I'm just thinking like when you pay somebody for an audiobook, they read, I think it's 6,000 words an hour. I
I've read
can't
six
remember
to
what
nine somewhere in there. Yeah.
so like I'm okay, great. 150 pages, and I'm thinking of how long you would be sitting there listening to essentially this audiobook in person.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're at the diner, and yes, there's a big storm and whatever. Okay, great. But realistically, you're there 4 or 5 hours
Yeah.
listening to the story. Like that seems unrealistic. But then we know that like as he sits down to write this, somehow he has additional information that he didn't absorb at that time. I don't know. Like I
Yeah.
didn't know what to make of that exactly, but
So back of the envelope math here. John Langan's The Fisherman is 70,500 words. And so about half of that, so 35,000 words, is this story. And if we go by let's call it 6,000 words an hour, what does that put you at? That's upwards of 5 or 6 hours, right? That's
yeah,
right in there.
it's a long time to hang out at a
At a
diner.
diner to have Lovecraft tell you a story. Yeah, it's funny you bring up that, because there's a couple lines saying he didn't know this, or like I found this out through reading obits or going through newspapers or whatever, stuff like that. But something I was thinking about, because in the first couple of chapters of that section they talk about like, oh, this I heard this from Reverend Maple, and he got this from talking with Lottie, but then also reading it in magazines. And so something I was thinking was like, where is this information coming from? And by 50 pages later, that was gone. I was just here for the ride. I didn't care how they found out what the leather belt felt like, or like that someone was wearing, or like how it felt to run your finger over the sigil carved in the axe. There's a bunch of very tactile details that you need for a story, but of course you can't get that from a newspaper.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I was trying to. I had a thought just a second ago, and it disappeared. Um, I don't know. Sorry, I lost it. But
um,
um,
well, something I did want to ask you, because it was something
sure.
that like stood out to me a lot in this book, was how different the kind of prose felt in the flashback versus about Abe and Dan, because it struck me that it the like when I started initially reading this book, it felt very it's kind of folksy, kind of homey. It's about like some retired guy and he's going through it, but kind of it reminded me of a lot of books that I edit, professionally, where I kind of wanted like an editor to have a stronger presence, being like, you can cut this full paragraph, man. Like, yeah, I don't need, whatever. But as soon as it got into the flashback, I felt like it shifted really radically, where, the story was kind of tighter. It was kind of meant to be, I don't know, less, maybe not taken more seriously, but it felt very different. And then what struck me is as soon as they went back, it changed again. Did that like strike you, or did you think about that, or did you notice that?
I did. Yeah. I'm glad you pointed that out. I had kind of forgotten about that, but yeah, I mean, it made the frame really distinct. Like the tone and the style of the two ends of it definitely felt consistent, and then that inset story really felt like its own thing, whether it's, I mean, one possibility is like literally it was written at a different time. Sometimes when you
Right,
go back to an old
right.
manuscript, you don't quite have the same style, but realistically, giving him the benefit of the doubt, like I think that was pretty interesting craft ability to really make that story distinct and unique. And the style, like you said, I mean, it's pretty tight. And the people who criticized it for telling a story instead of showing the story, I was like, I felt like I was there. Like I felt like there was a lot of action and it was well done, and it was pretty compelling. So, um, but yeah, you're right. The outside version of it was a little folksier and a little slower, um, and it was, initially it gave me pause as to like, what is this? What am I reading?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was exactly my thought. Where I hadn't read this book to my list for a while, and then I give it to this new friend, and I was like, oh God, did I just shoot myself in the foot and give this guy a dud? Um, yeah, it legitimately concerned me. I bounced off it kind of hard, and I don't know. I'm glad that we sat down because I don't know that I would have made it into where I started to enjoy it had we not been sitting down to talk about it today.
Uh, I remembered my thought from earlier, which was,
Yeah, hit
I
me.
mean, the end, without spoiling it entirely, I guess, it doesn't have the Lovecraftian end of like, here is
Hmm.
somebody in an insane asylum, like
Yeah.
that's what I kept waiting for, was like, okay, great. Like, what's this? And then like, no, it's like, nope, this just matter of fact, this stuff happened, and you can
Hmm.
either believe it or not. And
Yeah.
it was kind of interesting to have that choice, because a lot of times with like the horror thing, it's like, all right, how do you explain the supernatural? And in this case, it felt like Langan was just like, I'm not going to. Like, that's just it. You can believe it or not.
Yeah, there was no like maybe this is the ramblings of a crazy person. Like that window was not left open. Like I feel like you're not necessarily supposed to believe that in Lovecraft. Like when you're reading Call of Cthulhu, the point is that Cthulhu exists, but there is through the narrative it is available to believe. It's a valid interpretation that like maybe this guy was just nuts. But yeah, when after big traumatic climax happens, and then Abe is sitting in the hospital and he's being interviewed by detectives, there is like a line that says, yeah, I changed my story so that people would believe me, so I didn't think I was crazy. And yeah, it does, yeah, because I think that's such an interesting take, because it is so obviously Lovecraftian, and something that really made me like kind of realize that this is where he's so obviously drawing from was actually right before the flashback, where there's maybe 2 pages where he kind of talks about the story he's about to tell. There's too much buildup where they sit down and there's raining and it's the kind of contrived whatever, you're going to talk to this guy, but then for at least 2 pages he talks about and then we were struck by this tale of terror that was going to be told and blah blah blah, and that's like classic Lovecraft. That man loved that shit, and it was always like his stories were so short, and it was just like I always felt like he was padding them out, but it was just like, oh yeah, this is exactly where it's coming from, this is exactly what it's doing. But yeah, the ending was not him just clawing at a silent wall somewhere.
Yeah, which I kind of appreciated.
Yeah.
As reading the Lovecraft stories, I both appreciated the fact that like you could either see it as the, the ravings of a crazy person, or,
Yeah.
somebody who is broken by the experience that they had gone through.
Yeah.
Or, you can go like, well, that's just the veneer. Like that's what they want us to think, but like this
Yeah.
is true kind of thing. It also kind of felt like a cop out though, like um so I appreciated this one where it's just like, nope, I'm just earnest, like I'm just gonna go with the story. This is what it is. If you want to, for me, there were definitely lots of Lovecraftian moments, but like the ones that got me the most were probably like the tadpole eyeballs. Like I was
Yeah.
like, okay. And there were like tentacles and things like I didn't think about the Howard, but duh, right? Like that's a great one.
Yeah.
So thanks for pointing that out.
Oh yeah, no, that was not me. I lifted that from that review. But
Oh,
yeah,
that's
no, it
great.
struck me. I was like, "Oh, yeah, of course." It's so like, it's so obvious. It's right there,
So
Yeah.
one of the things I often think about with books like this is, if I was still teaching,
Mhm.
and I were to build a class around it, what
Hmm.
other books would I throw in there? And like like I said, I don't read a lot of horror.
Yeah.
I would definitely include a Lovecraft collection or some short stories or something like that. I was thinking of there was a book a couple years ago, Mexican Gothic,
Yes.
that was
Yeah.
literary horror, built
Yeah.
similar to this. That one, if I remember right, it was more the supernatural there was really explained through mushrooms
Yeah,
and
the
kind of like
fungus. Yeah.
fungus and that kind of stuff, which is kind of interesting. There was another one, Jawbone, that was Monica something. I can't remember her last name. And that one felt kind of similar to the Mexican Gothic. I could imagine like Victor LaValle's The Changeling, or
Hmm.
that one is, yeah, that was kind of interesting one. And he also had done like kind of an updated Frankenstein Gothic graphic novel.
Oh,
It was kind of
cool.
interesting too.
Yeah.
But anyway, who would you throw in your dream class to include the fisherman?
I think Mexican Gothic is a really good pick because this is a family drama, um, where it is about the grief of losing a family, and then spoilers at the end, that matters a lot about family lines and that kind of stuff. There are two Lovecraft stories that I would that made me think of because of that, and the first is Shadows over Innsmouth. The Shadows over Innsmouth.
Hmm.
But it's one of his more famous ones. But it's this kind of story about he's an antiquarian, because of course he is, and he's going to look at some uh like scrimshaw artifacts from this fishing village, and then spoiler alert for a story that came out 200 or 100 years ago, he's tied up in it. It's like his family, and the end of the story is this guy going crazy because he's like, oh, these people, these crazy like monstrosities, they are me, and I'm going to be this someday. And so it kind of punches you at the end where it's like, oh, this is a family drama. And then the other one that is very kind of similar to that is it's the facts. I just looked it up. It's the facts concerning the late Arthur Jerramond and his family.
Hmm.
And it's along that same line where it's someone kind of looking into their family history and realizing that like it is in me. I have these traits. I have this cursed blood. And so I think both of those are very interesting. Like would be takes for about the horror of the family. The kind of more modern book that I would want with this in kind of that horror genre, whose name escapes me. It came out of Grey Wolf just in the last couple of years. Oh, give me a second.
Yeah. Oh, and while you do that, I love the idea. I hadn't thought about kind of family drama, but you're right. I mean, that's an interesting way. Like, okay, great. We're going to do horror, family drama, build stories, or, build a class around kind of that theme. I was just thinking, I think just kind of in general, like a horror class, or literary horror, or whatever we want to call it. But
Yeah.
looks like you found it.
Yeah, it's Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen
Oh,
Maria
yeah, that's right.
Machado. Incredible book. It's a collection of short stories, and It came out at Grey Wolf in 2017, so not just a few years ago. But
I think that's the same year The Fisherman came out.
I think this was 2016, maybe.
Was it? Okay.
They're very close. Yeah, but a lot of those stories have to do with familiar relations and it building and attenuating of those bonds, and that how I don't know, that is horrific, or can be. Shouldn't be, but it can be. And yeah, no, my first thought was about a horror of the family. I had a film professor who talked about the he used the generic term, a melodrama. He was a Mexican professor, and I think he used that without the prejudice that, like, he used that term without the prejudice that we do. Like, if someone says melodrama, I think of something as kind of like a soap opera.
Yeah.
And he
overly
used it,
dramatic.
yeah, no, exactly. And he used it without it, not as a pejorative. And I think about that a lot when it comes to like family dramas, because it is about the drama of that tension. It's a melodrama. And I think that the like horror, melodramatic horror or something about the horror of the family was my first thought when you posed that question.
Yeah. I like that. And just kind of thinking about it a little bit more, I mean, um, sometimes professors for me looked too deep into stories and like invented things that, didn't really exist there. But like, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say like there are elements of environmentalism in this as well. Like, it's the water, they're digging a well, they're interfering with nature, like, um, the town literally gets buried because of their decisions. And, like, there's some of that stuff. Is that too much
Yeah.
of a stretch?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that is such a reality of where we are. It's hard not to see it in everything. But I think you're right. It is there. I mean, the whole tension of the flashback is that New York City doesn't have enough water, right? And so
Right.
it's the growth of this massive metropolitan area, and so it is literally destroying the countryside. But also, I think from when talking of just about the Dutchman's Creek where they go to, I mean, it isn't so far to believe that's like some polluted creek where people are pulling strange fish out of or dying because they're eating the fish or whatever, right? I mean, that is all there.
Yeah. Anything else we should say about the book? Any other final thoughts you have?
I think that you hit the nail on the head when this is an interesting book as far as the construction. I have not read a book like that before, where there are kind of discrete pieces. There are three chapters of this, like three sections of his book, where it's the intro about Dan and Abe, the flashback, and then what kind of happens when they collide in chapter 3 or part 3, I guess. And yeah, I think that I think is the strongest selling point to me. If you like that kind of gothic horror, it's all there. But yeah, I have never seen a book do that and kind of make it work like this one did, and I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah. And thinking, I often struggle with titles for books or short
Yeah,
stories. That's the worst, because like I've written this long thing and now you want me to distill it into like 3 to 10 words.
yeah,
And, so like, what a gift that, The Fisherman works. And then I also think like, I am not one who enjoys fishing. For me, like,
yeah,
fishing is just like, my brother does it, like other people do it. I don't have the patience. Like, I'm fine being alone in my head and my thoughts, but like, I don't need to hold a rod and reel to make that happen. But in a lot of ways, like, this story works as fishing, right? It's like a long story. It takes a while to catch something, it's
yeah.
kind of drawn out. And it's I don't know, like, I wonder who came up with the title. That's the other thing. Like, did the editor come up with the title?
Right.
For John, was his idea like this much longer title, and somebody else was like, simplify it.
Yeah, no, cut that. Yeah, like the facts concerning Abe and Dan and fishing stories. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I think you're right that the central metaphor of like this is a fishing story. It's some exaggerated story about the fish that went away or something, but it's literally someone telling you this story about all of this arcane, pulpy horror. I think that works really well. Of all the frame narratives, heard it from a friend, of a friend, of a friend. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for bringing it to my attention. Definitely, if you haven't read The Fisherman, it's certainly worth a shot. Graham and I both really enjoyed it. Despite misgivings and questions along the way, I think ultimately at the end of the day, we would say like, yeah, it's worth a read. Probably not the scariest thing in the world, but definitely a
sorry,
novel
Tor.
novel.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it.
Cool. Well, have a great day.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about me at my webpage, michaelmacbride.com, or on most social media platforms with the same handle, at Michael MacBride. That's MacBride, like Mac and Bride. Let me know what you're listening to, or if you read one of these books, leave me a comment and let me know what you thought. Have a great day.